Welcome back to Hot Air with me, Joshua Robert. And as promised on today's episode, which is a Friday, if you're listening to it on a Friday, when it comes out, we're sticking to some important topics that are timely and that I feel that we should be made aware of. And I was going to say that we're going to revisit spooky season on Tuesday's episode, but this is actually quite horrific and horrifying and scary, and sometimes reality is far scarier than we may like it to be. So this kind of, to me, is like on point with spooky season. But before we get into it, make sure you're following me on Instagram and TikTok at _hotairpod. You can submit your topic suggestions and your listener stories on my website, Hot Air with Joshua Robert. And if you are listening to this episode on Friday, October 17th, make sure to check out my Instagram later today if you are a San Diego local, because I have partnered with Fabulous Hillcrest and we are doing a 2-ticket giveaway to Nightmare on Normal Street, which is the biggest Halloween block party in San Diego. It is the place to be. You do not want to miss it. So if you're a San Diego local, or you might be coming to town or need a reason to come to town, like, why not go to this wild, gay, huge Halloween bash? So later today, I'll do a post on Instagram and I'm going to let you know how to enter the giveaway. It's super easy. There's 4 very simple things that you need to do. So stick around. That'll be coming out 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So let's get to the reason that we are here. Imagine this. You're 15 years old. You're already dizzy from the usual teenage BS, school, friends, that crushing confusion about who you might become. You tell someone you're attracted to the same sex, or you tell them you're trans, or someone, a trusted adult, a counselor, suggests that maybe those feelings are a problem that can be fixed. And they say there is a way to change you. And that is called conversion therapy. And for decades, the medical community has said it is not therapy at all. It's harmful. It increases depression and suicide risk. It's banned for minors in many states. But right now, the U.S. Supreme Court, and by right now, I mean, I think it was about 9 days ago, is hearing a case that could change everything. The case is Childs v. Salazar. And if the court rules for the petitioner, Colorado's law banning licensed counselors from subjecting minors to conversion therapy could be struck down. That wouldn't just endanger Colorado's youth, it could put similar bans across the country at risk. So today on Hot Air, we're doing a full, deep, just me episode on what this all means. I'm going to walk you through it all. We're going to talk conversion therapy, what it is, why the medical establishment opposes it, the legal arguments at the Supreme Court, voices on both sides, how this could reshape protections across the United States, and what you, a listener, can do to help protect young LGBTQ plus youth. This is heavy, it's urgent, it matters, so let's hit it. Part 1. What is conversion therapy? First, definitions. Let's get some things very clear. Conversion therapy, which is sometimes called reparative therapy, sexual orientation change efforts, or gender identity change efforts, refers to practices that try to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. These practices vary. Talk therapy that frames LGBTQ plus as something to fix, behavioral techniques, or even religious counseling that attempts to align a young person's identity with their faith. The common theme is the aim to change core aspects of identity. Let's talk about some important legal and medical clarifications right from the get-go. The major American medical and mental health organizations like the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, among others, have concluded that conversion therapy is ineffective and harmful. They advise against it and support bans for minors. The scientific consensus is that these practices can increase depression, anxiety, self harm, and suicide attempts among youth. So, when lawmakers in many states enacted bans, they did so to protect minors from these documented harms. As of early 2025, a majority of states and DC had laws prohibiting licensed practitioners from offering conversion therapy to minors. The exact number changes as courts and legislatures act, but those protections have been established in many parts of the country, which is a good thing. But opponents of those bans argue something completely different. They say the laws aren't about protecting children, but about limiting speech and religious expression. That is the crux of the legal fight we're going to dig into. Are state bans on conversion therapy a permissible regulation of professional conduct or an unconstitutional restriction on speech? That question is now before the Supreme Court. Part 2. The legal fight. Childs v. Salazar. Let's get into the specific case that the Supreme Court is heard just about 9 days ago. Childs v. Salazar. The story begins in Colorado. In 2019, Colorado passed a law that prohibits licensed medical health professionals from subjecting minors to practices that attempt to change a young person's sexual orientation or gender identity. The law was modeled on similar statutes and was part of a wave of state actions designed to protect minors from conversion therapy. A licensed counselor, Kaylee Childs, filed suit challenging that Colorado law. She's represented by the conservative legal group Alliance Defending Freedom, otherwise known as ADF. Her claim? The law violates the First Amendment. She says that the conversations she would have with some clients are a form of protected speech, like theological or therapeutic speech, and that the law censors that speech and prevents clients and counselors from voluntarily pursuing the counseling that they want. Essentially, she argues the state has crossed the line by criminalizing and prohibiting certain counselor-client discussions, aka therapizing the gay out of you. So lower courts, including the 10th Circuit, rejected her claim, reasoning that what Childs does in a counseling session is professional conduct, which the state can regulate. But the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and the oral arguments in October 2025, just a few days ago, revealed a court divided, and in many moments, skeptical of Colorado's law. Several justices pressed the state on the limits of professional speech doctrine and whether the state's ban might sweep too broadly. Reporting from multiple outlets indicated a majority of justices seemed concerned about free speech implications. So here's how the two sides are framing the argument. Childs and ADF. They say that this is about free speech and religious liberty. Counselors should be allowed to offer voluntary counseling, including faith-informed counseling to minors and their families. The state should not be able to character police conversations between minors and licensed professionals. Childs has said she seeks to help religious young people harmonize their feelings and their faith, and that the law cuts off access to counseling that parents want. And on the other side of this argument, we have Colorado and advocacy groups. They say that this is about protecting kids and professional standards. They say the law regulates professional practice, not private speech, and that the government has a compelling interest in protecting minors from a set of discredited practices shown to cause harm. Medical organizations back this view. The state and groups like the HRC and the Trevor Project argue that allowing conversion therapy will lead to more harm for a vulnerable population. Now, why does this matter beyond Colorado? Because about 24 states have laws like Colorado's. If the Supreme Court decides these bans are unconstitutional as to speech, it could invalidate many state protections, changing the legal landscape nationwide. And that is not hypothetical. Major reporting indicates many legal experts worry that a ruling for Childs would jeopardize bans in states including Minnesota, Virginia, and many others. Part 3. What the justices asked at oral arguments. Courtroom reporting on oral arguments in early October showed how the justices approached the case. Several conservative justices expressed concern about whether the government should be allowed to place content-based restrictions on what counselors can say. Some suggested that if the state can ban this kind of counseling speech, it could open the door to more speech regulation in other professional contexts, a slippery slope for First Amendment protections. And that I do get. It's like, where do you draw the line? And how do you know when to stay on one side of the line and not cross it? Meanwhile, Justice Sonia Sotomayor and others asked pointed questions about harm. Sotomayor drew an analogy in one reported exchange that resonated. She worried if a dietitian could counsel an anorexic patient to starve, would the state have the power to ban the counseling? That analogy was used to explore whether the state's interest in protecting health can justify restrictions on speech in clinical settings. Other justices asked whether the law was truly content-based and how narrowly or broadly it applied. These courtroom exchanges matter, especially now more than ever, because they reveal the legal lenses that the justices are using, and we know that some of them are pretty skewed. First Amendment doctrine versus public health and professional regulation. The conservative majority's inclination to protect speech, especially in professional contexts, makes some advocates worry the court may strike down these bans. That could shift the regulatory balance away from state efforts to protect youth. Part 4. Voices. Quotes from both sides. Let's put some real voices into this. I've got some quotes from people and groups on both sides of this argument. First, Kelly Robinson, president of the Human Rights Campaign, reacted to the Supreme Court oral argument saying, so-called conversion therapy is not therapy. It's a discredited pseudoscience rooted in shame, and it has caused deep, documented harm to young people. End quote. That's the argument from advocates. The practice is harmful and must be restricted to protect minors. I concur. Hello. Probably not surprising to anyone. The American Psychological Association states that efforts to change sexual orientation or gender identity have no, I repeat, no scientific validity and cause severe psychological harm. Their public materials note increased risk of depression and suicide attempts among survivors of conversion therapy. That is the medical evidence side of this debate. From survivor-led organizations and legal advocates like GLAAD and the Trevor Project, filings to the court emphasize personal stories of damage. Survivors describe trauma, family estrangement, and long-term mental health consequences. These organizations urge the court to uphold the bans to protect youth. You know, the more I'm talking about this and letting this episode and this process, the more I'm like, so you talk about how you, Republicans, far-right people that are for this conversion therapy, talk so much about protecting the youth and protecting the children and keeping them safe and not forcing any kind of sexuality on them. But when you are approaching conversion therapy, you are forcing a straight identity on them or a cisgender identity on them. So you are sexualizing them instead of allowing them to blossom and grow and figure out who they are on their own. So it really goes both ways. I mean, I obviously don't believe that there is a gay agenda and that the gays are groomers and that drag queens in schools are going to force people to be trans. I, of course, disagree with that wholeheartedly. However, if your argument is protecting the children, that should be across the board. And now on the flip side of this, we've got some quotes and some feedback from the people that are kind of all for conversion therapy. Kaylee Childs, the petitioner, told reporters and filed briefs arguing she seeks to provide voluntary counseling to religious youth who request it. Counseling that she says aims to, and I quote, reduce or eliminate unwanted sexual attractions, change sexual behaviors, or grow in the experience of harmony with one's physical body. End quote. She frames the issue as one of free speech and religious conscience. And again, religion making its way right back into these laws. Church and state, it's all one now. What fun. Oh, sorry. I digress. Reel it in. Then we have Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, representing Childs, has characterized the law as a censorship of counselors and their clients. From ADF press material, they argue that the law, I quote, violates licensed counselors' freedom of speech and their clients' right to seek voluntary counseling, end quote. Language that you will hear a lot from advocates who prioritize religious liberty and speech protections in this specific case. Conservative legal commentators and some religious freedom advocates have framed the case as protecting a therapist's ability to practice in accordance with their beliefs and preventing the state from imposing a single orthodoxy about identity in the therapy room. Woo, that was a long sentence. For example, some attorneys and commentators argue the law compels silence from clinicians who would otherwise discuss religious or faith-based perspectives with their clients. So notice the rhetorical frames. Supporters of banning conversion therapy emphasize public health and the consensus of the medical community. The others that are for conversion therapy are talking about free speech and religious freedom. And then the Supreme Court now has to weigh those frames against each other. Part 5. The empirical evidence and why it matters. Let's unpack the evidence the court is being asked to consider. Medical and mental health organizations have compiled decades of evidence showing that conversion therapy is ineffective and harmful, but God forbid anybody listen to the experts. The APA and other bodies have positioned statements describing increased depression, anxiety, and suicide risk associated with these practices. The consensus is strong enough that legislatures have enacted bans across the country. If there was not evidence, there would not be those bans. Proponents of the bans point to that scientific consensus as the justification for regulation. The state has a compelling interest in protecting children's health. Opponents, including ADF and the petitioner's arguments, counter that much of the evidence concerns coercive or physical forms of conversion practices, not all forms of talk therapy. They argue the law casts too wide a net and censors voluntary conversations. But here is the key. Almost every major medical organization concludes that attempts to change sexual orientation and gender identity are inherently risky and unsupported by credible research. How many times can I say it till I'm blue in the face? That is why so many states moved to ban licensed professionals from offering these practices to minors. The legal question is whether that regulatory choice is compatible with the First Amendment when the challenged speech occurs in a professional therapeutic context. Part 6. The map of state protections and what a SCOTUS ruling could do. Right now, about 23 states plus DC have laws banning licensed professionals from performing conversion therapy on minors. Other states have partial restrictions or none at all. Advocacy groups and legal trackers keep updated maps. If the Supreme Court rules that the First Amendment bars these state laws, at least as applied to licensed professionals, it could endanger bans in many jurisdictions and create a patchwork where minors in some states have protections and minors in others do not. I should have noted this at the top. This is referring to professionals, professional therapists. This is not talking about the conversion therapy that they do in the fucking backwoods in those podunk ass churches. We're not talking about that. This is about the professionals. Back to my professional voice. Some states have already seen erosion in protections through litigation. For example, in Virginia, certain enforcement aspects were challenged and narrowed in 2025. And that's a preview of what a nationwide precedent might do. It could invite legal challenges across many states and change the regulatory environment for counseling. For families and survivors, that is a life and death issue, and that's not an exaggeration. Conversion therapy is linked directly to higher suicide risk for LGBTQ plus youth. A Supreme Court holding that forbids states from regulating certain professional speech could reduce the legal tools available to protect minors. That is the fear driving many advocates, and the reason national groups like HRC and the Trevor Project urged the court to uphold bans. Part 7. Human stories and the emotional stakes. We can talk statute and SCOTUS and precedent until I lose my voice, but the real stakes are human. And what matters are the humans that are involved in this conversion therapy. Conversion therapy survivors tell stories that are heartbreaking and infuriating. Young people coerced into treatments, families fractured, years lost, years gone. GLAAD, the Trevor Project, and other groups have submitted survivor briefs to the court describing consequences like long-term anxiety, substance abuse, and self-harm. Those that are still around to tell their stories. And those stories are part of the record that the court saw. And they are why so many advocates are sounding the alarm. On the other side of this argument, supporters of Childs point to hypothetical families who want faith-aligned counseling and argue that adults should be able to seek out counselors who share their worldview. The question the court faces is how to balance those parental and conscience interests with the state's interest in protecting vulnerable minors. But for the people who live through conversion therapy, this legal balancing feels completely abstracted compared to the very real harm that they have experienced. Part 8. Legal implications and possible outcomes. So what could the court do? Well, they could uphold Colorado's ban on conversion therapy. That would preserve similar bans in many states and confirm that regulations aimed at professional conduct or medical treatment are permissible, even if they limit certain therapists' speech. That outcome would be a victory for health advocates. Or they could strike down the law broadly. The court could find the law unconstitutional as applied to professional speech. That could render similar state bans vulnerable and limit states' ability to regulate counselor speech regarding sexual orientation and gender identity. There could also be a narrower ruling. The court might craft a narrower rule, perhaps protecting some speech, but allowing states to regulate coercive practices or certain harmful conduct. A narrow compromise could preserve some protections while constraining state power to regulate speech. That's a less likely but possible middle path. Court watchers think the conservative majority's attention to First Amendment arguments may lead to a ruling narrowing state power, but exactly how far is still uncertain. The stakes aren't only legal doctrine, they're the difference between having a legislative tool to protect youth or not. Part 9. What listeners can do. If you care about this issue, and chances are if you're listening to Hot Air, you do care about this issue. If you care about protecting LGBTQ plus youth, here are some concrete things that you can do. Of course, stay informed. Follow reputable sources like the HRC, the Trevor Project, GLAAD, and local advocacy groups for updates. I'll see if I can link some in the show notes. You can also support survivor organizations. Donate, volunteer, find some nonprofits that provide mental health resources and crisis support for LGBTQ plus youth, and donate your time or your money. Contact your representatives. If your state is considering legislation on this issue, weigh in. Lawmakers need to hear from constituents that protecting minors matters, and that means not allowing conversion therapy of any fucking sort. If you're a therapist or provider, follow professional ethical guidance. All major health organizations advise against conversion therapy. If you see a young person in crisis, prioritize evidence-based affirmative care and allow them to sort out who they are with your guidance. Don't try to guide them down a road just because you think that is the right direction. This is the kind of issue where the law and real lives completely collide. The more people pay attention and push for evidence-based humane policy, the better chance we have of protecting young people who are vulnerable. Now, this is not only about doctrines and headlines. This is about young people who deserve to be accepted, who deserve care that affirms their lives, and who deserve a legal system that recognizes the weight of scientific consensus and human dignity. And that's very hard for the legal system to do lately, especially in terms of any scientific evidence, aka acetaminophen. The Supreme Court's decision in Childs v. Salazar will be consequential, and whatever the outcome, it's going to be a call to action. If the court preserves state bans on conversion therapy, advocates will keep building systems that protect youth. If the court narrows or strikes down those bans, advocates and lawmakers will need to find new ways to safeguard children, perhaps through different forms of regulation, licensing enforcement, and community resources. And this episode was very serious, very heavy. I know that. I barely cracked a joke, but this is clearly very important and it matters. History is being made in that courtroom right now, and the consequences will be felt in therapy rooms, in families, in the lives of real kids while they're sitting at home trying to figure out who the fuck they are. If you care, don't just feel, act. Be an ally, put your money where your mouth is, and step up. So before we go, as I said, I'm going to link some resources, some links to the HRC, the Trevor Project, GLAAD, etc. in the show notes should anybody want them. I will also link to some hotlines and mental health resources for LGBTQ plus youth in crisis. If you are a LGBTQ plus youth that is listening, I'm with you. Okay, I'm with you, boo. I got you, and you have way more people standing with you than you do against you. If this episode moved you, share it. Talk to your friends. If you are able, donate to organizations that support LGBTQ plus youth mental health. This is one of those moments where community really matters. And I will be back on Tuesday with maybe a slightly lighter episode to just, help us breathe a little bit. It's actually going to be really entertaining. It may or may not have to do with gay conspiracy theories, aliens. There's one about Taylor Swift in there too. It's weird. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to Hot Air. Remember to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at _hotairpod. Submit your listener stories and your topic suggestions, or if you have any guests that you think I should have on, you can let me know about that as well. Visit my website, hotairwithjoshuarobert.com. So let's take care of each other, take care of yourself, and take care of the youth, because they're going to be taking care of us in old age homes soon enough. Again, thanks for listening. I'm Josh, and I will see you next Tuesday.